Witch's Sister by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 1. She first suspected Judith was a witch that spring when she found her looking for tadpoles in Cowden's Creek. It was how Judith was catching them that made Lynn think it. Instead of using a net, Judith simply cupped her hands in the water and crooned to them. They swam right into her fingers. That was only the beginning, though. There were other things, too. But it wasn't till her mother went to work the following summer, leaving Judith in charge, that Lynn's suspicions grew too big to hold in. What had possessed Mother to go to work in a hen house when she could have worked at home? It all seemed part of the same plot somehow. She simply said one night that the time had come, and when Lynn got up in the morning, there was her mother packing paper and envelopes and stamps into a large shopping bag on the kitchen table. Lynn sat down on a stool and surveyed the confusion. Beside the shopping bag lay two of her mother's books, Shy River and A Horse Named Harry. On the cover of each, in neat black letters, were the words, by Sylvia Jackson Morley. Mrs. Morley picked these up last, placed them in the sack on top of her dictionary. There were 5 other books already packed. "What's happening?" Lynn asked, her voice still foggy with sleep. She was afraid her mother might be running away. There were times when Mrs. Morley was somewhat unpredictable, but at least there had always been breakfast on the table. This morning there wasn't a trace of egg or cereal anywhere. "I'm off to my studio," Mother said, her face beaming. 5 days a week from 9 to 4, but I'll be home for lunch. Lynn started. "Mother! You're not really going to work in that chicken coop." "It's not a coop, my dear. It's a lovely little hen house. And it even has a stove for the winter. There hasn't been a chicken in it for 2 years, and Mrs. Tuggle and I have cleaned it thoroughly. When I've got it all arranged, you'll have to come see it." "But you've always worked at home before," Lynn protested. "You have that little corner in the sewing room, and you can go up there and shut the door, and 5 minutes later Stevie opens it because he wants a cookie, or you open it to ask if you can go to Marjorie's, or Judith opens it to get the pinking shears or the thread. For 13 years I've been writing in bits and pieces, a few hours here, a few hours there, and nobody considers it working. Now that you girls are old enough to take over here at home, I've decided to rent a place where I can write undisturbed. Besides," she stopped packing and tested the sack to make sure she could carry it, "I'm getting away from my own interruptions as well. Sometimes when a book's going poorly, I come downstairs and clean the over or sort through the unmatched socks. Now I won't have any excuse to get away, will I?" She smiled and leaned over to give Lynn a quick hug. Something ghost-like in a white gown appeared in the doorway and was gone again. Lynn jerked her head just in time to see Judith going past. That was another thing. Judith never seemed to make a sound when she went anywhere. She just came on like an apparition. Bodily transportation. Wasn't that what witches called it? Mrs. Morley looked at her watch. "Well, I'd better be off. I've got just 7 minutes to get there with this shopping bag, and it's uphill all the way." "Who's going to care if you're 3 minutes late?" "I care," Mother said firmly. "There will be no last-minute delays to fix somebody a slice of toast. Once I give in to that, I'll never get out the door." "But what about us?" Lynn bleated, her stomach rumbling under her striped pajamas. "Breakfast is on the back porch this morning. I thought you might enjoy it there. I'll be home about 12 to get lunch. And listen, darling, during the 6 hours I'm gone each day, you girls are equally responsible for Stevie. If there's any disagreement, however, it's Judith who has the final say." "Judith!" Lynn wailed. "Yes, because she's oldest. You'll both find a list of jobs and responsibilities on the closet door, and I expect you to read them every morning before you go anywhere." She stopped and looked over with an amused smile that Lynn could not share. "Why so glum? Look at it as an adventure. Who knows what the rest of the summer will bring?" Then picking up her bulging sack, Mrs. Morley walked to the front door, kicked open the screen with one foot, staggered across the porch, down the steps, across the lawn, down more steps to the sidewalk below, and then, weaving slightly, started up the hill to Mrs. Tuggle's. Stevie was still asleep, and the house seemed unusually quiet for 9 o'clock on a July morning. 9 more weeks of summer, 9 weeks of 6 hours a day with Judith, 9 weeks of Judith appearing, disappearing, Judith staring out the window, Judith crooning those strange little tunes and talking to the trees as though they were listening. Lynn opened the refrigerator door, took a piece of bread, and stuffed it in her mouth to stop the stomach noises. She knew what she'd better do. Call Mouse. Mouse was really Marjorie Beasley, but her nickname suited her better. Her hair was short and rather clipped off below the ears. She had a nose that sloped in the usual fashion, and then tilted suddenly upward at the end, curving back around like the bottom of the letter B. Two small dark eyes peered out through enormous glasses. Marjorie was a month older than Lynn, but seemed younger because she was so short and skinny. No one would have guessed she was going into 6th grade in the fall. Lynn sat down by the telephone in the front hall and dialed her number. Mouse, she said, I've got to talk to you. What about? I just woke up. I can't say. You'll have to come over. What have you got to eat? Mouse asked, not particularly impressed. Just a minute and I'll look. Lynn laid down the phone and checked the refrigerator. Mouse always had to be bribed. Wheaties, she said, coming back, and bananas and Fritos and some ham salad for lunch. That's all I could find. Mouse considered it. I'll have breakfast here, she said. Mom left some waffles. Be over later. Listen, Mouse, this is urgent. This is the most urgent thing I ever had to tell you. There was no reply. Maybe Marjorie had gone to sleep. Lynn whispered into the receiver. This is about life and death and everything awful. I'll be over as soon as I eat my waffle, Mouse said and hung up. Lynn made her way barefoot back through the kitchen again and onto the screened porch. Cereal and muffins sat waiting on the small table by the glider. Lynn poured some Wheaties into her bowl, rested it against her stomach, and leaned back to think over what she would tell Mouse. Beyond the back porch was Mother's garden, separating the lawn from the big field, and beyond the field, with its bramble and blueberry bushes, ran Cowden's Creek, winding its way around the town and joining up somewhere with the Wabash. It ran deep in some places, shallow in others, and was nice for swimming if you didn't mind the crawfish. There was really only one big hill in town, and the Morleys lived on it. Not right at the top, that was Mrs. Tuggle's house, but on one side of it, where the street ran steep and wide. The sidewalks were of old brick, laid at an angle, and oak trees lined the pavement as far down as Linden's Corner, their heavy branches forming a canopy of leaves in the summer and snow in the winter. Like the Morleys, every house on the street had been built with gables and porches and bay windows framed in stained glass insets. Each house was different from all the others. The Morleys, for instance, was the only house with a closet under the stairs and an attic above the 3rd floor. Beneath the attic was one great room divided by a heavy curtain. Lynn slept on one side and Judith on the other. Lynn's part of the room had the gables and faced the street. Judith's overlooked the field and back. On the floor beneath were their parents' bedroom, Stevie's, a bath, and a sewing room, and on the 1st floor were the living and dining rooms with their pillared doorways, the huge kitchen, and a cozy little alcove called the music room because it held a piano. The bay window was in the music room, with a cushioned window seat, the favorite sitting talking place for Lynn and Mouse. Beneath the whole house, of course, was the basement, with its earthen floor, smelling of onions and potatoes and apples. It was the only house Lynn ever remembered having lived there all her life. She went back inside and put the milk in the refrigerator. With Mother gone, 5-year-old Stevie asleep, and Judith floating around somewhere above, the house had an eerie kind of stillness, broken only by the occasional creaking and moaning of the old beams and floorboards. Lynn climbed the stairs to the landing, the stairs to the 2nd floor, and then the steep stairs to the 3rd, which led right into her bedroom. Beyond the heavy drawn curtain, she could hear pages turning and knew that Judith was back there reading. She stuck her pajamas in the drawer and pulled on her shoes and shirt. There was no skirt, I just read it wrong. Then she brushed her hair and pulled it back into a ponytail, trying not to look in the mirror as she did so. Lynn didn't care for mirrors because she seldom liked what she saw, a somewhat long face with gray eyes and faint freckles on pale skin. Absolutely nothing to get excited about, not even a dimple. A row of white daisies growing in small pots sat on the windowsill of Lynn's room. She studied them as she twisted a rubber band around her hair and back, and wondered what Judith was growing on her side of the room. Hemlock, she thought, pulling on her sneakers. Where are you going? Judith's voice intruded so suddenly that Lynn jumped. How did Judith know she was going somewhere? Out with Mouse. Don't forget to do your work before Mom comes home at lunchtime. Lynn ran downstairs to check the list on the closet door. Mom would have made a good army sergeant or a school teacher or a travel agent or something. She was full of ideas and plans, which she jotted down on paper and taped around the house. Time, she always said, was a priceless possession, and housework was for getting out of the way as quickly as possible. Monday, read the list on the closet door. Lynn, make beds, run carpet sweeper over downstairs rugs. Do lunch dishes, keep an eye on Stevie for the afternoon. She grabbed the carpet sweeper from the closet, rolled it quickly over the rugs, and shoved it back inside just as Marjorie rang the bell. Mouse lived 2 blocks away in a house with 4 gables instead of 3. She arrived on her bike, which was always parked directly at the bottom of the long steps, making Mr. Morley boom whenever he saw it. "Is that Beasley girl here again?" Marjorie's father owned a store on First Avenue that sold rare books. Her mother worked as a secretary in a dentist's office, and her 2 brothers were married, which meant that Mouse was more or less on her own during the summer. This probably explained why she dressed the way she did and why Judith seemed so repelled by her. Clothes, to Marjorie Beasley, were a legal necessity, having no useful function whatsoever except in wintertime. Shoes were obviously meant to come untied and trip her, socks to sag, jeans to rip, shirts to wrinkle and choke about her neck, and if Marjorie owned a dress, Lynn was not sure she had ever seen it. Once, for a whole week, Mouse had come to school in a huge poncho that hung down below her bony knees, and Lynn had suspected she had nothing on underneath but a pair of pants. It certainly simplified dressing. On this particular day, Mouse had on 1 yellow sock and 1 white one and a pair of sneakers that had ripped out at the toes, and the same jeans and shirt she had worn all week. Lynn bolted through the screen. "Not here," she said. "We've got to go to our private place." Mouse clattered down the porch steps after her, her glasses bobbing on her nose. "Wow, it must be super secret." Lynn raced ahead, galloping down the long flight of stone steps to the sidewalk below. A moment later, the girls were flying down the hill on Marjorie's bicycle, careening around the corner and heading out the west road toward the cemetery. Cemeteries were good talking places. There was a spot under an oak tree in the center where the tombstone of Mrs. Elfreda Lewis had fallen down in front of the tombstone of Mr. Lewis, making a perfect chair with a high back. Lynn always took this seat, while Mouse sat on a scroll held between 2 angels. Sitting there on the scroll usually made Mouse quiet and rather pensive. The drama of death held a certain fascination for her, and she wasn't supposing how it felt to be dead. And if she wasn't supposing how it felt to be dead and have no feelings, she was imagining she was being lifted right up to the sky by the white marble angels who looked sadly down upon her with no eyelids at all. But this time she couldn't wait for the news. "What?" she whispered. "Tell me." Lynn chose her words carefully. It was a terrible accusation she was making, and she had to say it just right. She sat up straight on the tombstone, folded her hands, and said evenly, "I've come to the conclusion that Judith possesses supernatural powers." "What?" "I suspect that she is being influenced by spirits and creatures of another realm." "You mean?" "Exactly. Judith is a witch." Mouse leaned forward, her arms around the angels' necks, and stared. "Lynn, are you sure?" "Of course I'm not positive. I've got to have proof, and you've got to help me, but I sincerely, honestly, truthfully believe that she is." "Why?" Oh, it was delicious. Too delicious almost to talk about. The goosebumps stood out on Lynn's arms just thinking about it. "Dozens of things, because of the way tadpoles were swimming right over to her down at the creek, because of the way she sings to herself and talks to things and stares right through a person. It can happen, you know, to anybody. Spirits can take over anyone." Mouse squirmed a little between the angels. A gusty breeze whipped over the graveyard, rustling the thick foliage of the oak trees above, contrasting sharply with the silence of the dead. "But Lynn, it's got to be more than just tadpoles. You need more evidence than that." "I know, Mouse. Do you remember when I had poison ivy all over my legs and had to wear bandages to school, and Stevie got it on his arms? We were all picking daisies out in the field, Judith and Stevie and I, and Judith didn't get poison ivy at all. Doesn't that seem strange to you? And remember that awful storm on my birthday? And Judith had a gorgeous day for her party, and when our family went to Chicago during spring vacation, someone broke into the car and stole all our coats, all except Judith's raincoat. They left that right on the seat as if there was a hex on it or something, and Judith never even seemed surprised. She knows it's going to happen because she plans it that way. She reads books and she won't let me see them, and she sings strange songs, croons them really, and you never hear her coming or going anymore. She just shows up somewhere and the next minute she's gone. Marjorie sat quietly for a moment thinking it over. Is that all? She asked finally. No, Lynn sat forward on her knees and faced Mouse. I think she's in the power of someone else. Mouse glanced at her sideways. Who? She asked warily. Someone very old and wise. Mrs. Tuggle? Right. Judith's up there half the time, isn't she? Mrs. Tuggle's supposedly teaching her to sew, but Judith never brings home anything she's made and nobody asks her questions. How often does she go? Several times a week. She stays for hours. And when she gets home, she goes right to her room and hums and recites little things to herself. Have you told your folks all this? Not yet, I've got to be sure, but listen, not a single word to anyone. Promise? If it's true, and if Judith knows that we know, well... Mouse, have you ever heard of bodily transportation? Body what? A witch, Lynn told her, can use her psychic powers to transport a person bodily from one place to another. If Judith even suspected we knew, she could put us down in Brazil. She'd tell Mom we got in a car with a stranger and nobody would ever hear of us again. Marjorie's nose wriggled with excitement. What are we going to do then? I don't know. I haven't decided yet, but we'd better learn all we can about witchcraft so we can stop her before she does something awful. Lynn, I know! Mouse leaped off the scroll so suddenly their glasses slipped and dangled from one ear. Know what? Last week Daddy came home with a box of old books he bought at an auction. He said they were very valuable, and there was one on witchcraft. I know! He showed it to me. Spells and Potions, that was the name. Mouse, you've got to get it for me. I can't. Daddy said the books weren't to leave the house. Then there's only one thing left to do, Lynn said, looking right at her. I know, said Mouse miserably. Every word, added Lynn. You've got to read every word, Mouse, so we don't miss anything. Lynn, there are 400 pages. But Mouse, it could mean my life. Okay, I'll do it, Marjorie sighed. But all that reading's going to make me hungry. Peanut butter sandwiches, as many as you want. I'll make them myself. Lynn got a ride back as far as the hill, where Mouse let her off and went on home. Slowly, Lynn climbed the steep slope, walking pigeon-toed to fit her feet in the pattern of slanting brick. It all made sense somehow. If anybody in the Morley family was prone to possession, it was Judith. Judith, unlike herself, was a follower, Lynn decided. Weren't the walls of Judith's room covered with pictures of famous actors and singing stars? Didn't she always have to wear whatever shoes or jeans or earrings the other girls were wearing? Didn't Judith study her astrology guide every day and believe whatever the horoscope told her? Since she had been spending her evenings at Mrs. Tuggle's, however, Judith had spent less and less time with her girlfriends. She had stopped listening to rock and hummed instead the wisps of tunes she'd learned from Mrs. Tuggle. She was slowly changing, and nobody seemed to notice, except for her, Lynn. For some reason, she was able to see things more clearly than she ever had before, and she did not like what she saw in Judith. She reached the house and walked up the long flight of steps to the walk above. Then up the steps to the porch. Even before she opened the screen, she heard the strange crooning. Cautiously, she slipped inside. Judith was sitting on the window seat in the music room. She was dressed in blue shorts and a blue shirt, and her long, dark hair hung loosely down her back and over her shoulders. Her face was like a delicate china doll's with perfectly formed lips. Judith was slightly on the plump side, but Lynn would have traded figures with her instantly if she could have had her sister's face in the bargain. Judith was sitting very still, and her eyes had a faraway look in them, as though she were still half asleep. Then Lynn noticed that she was holding a jar in her hands, turning it absently around and around in the sunlight, and chanting softly, "From the shadows of the pool, black as midnight, thick as gruel, come, my nymphs, and you shall be silent images of me." Judith's fingernails seemed unusually long, Lynn thought, longer than she'd ever noticed before. Judith was staring into the jar with strange fascination as she crooned, and suddenly Lynn's heart leapt up. There were tadpoles in the jar, and Judith was talking to them as though they were in her control, as though she had the power to change them into something else. "Where did you go?" came Judith's voice. She didn't even turn around. Lynn was sure she hadn't made a sound. "How did you know I was back?" Why are you always spying on me? Judith asked in answer. Lynn shrugged, trying to sound casual. Who's interested in you? Just didn't think you heard me come in, that's all. She stood there a moment, watching her sister, and suddenly felt a twinge of concern. Judith, why don't you go out somewhere? It's better than sitting around all day by yourself. Judith's lips turned into a strange kind of smile, and she bent over her jar again, watching the tadpoles with an odd kind of tenderness. Maybe I have friends you don't even know about, she said almost to herself, and Lynn fled silently upstairs. And that's the end of chapter 1.